Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriel, and we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages with an American twist, as we always do this week. I am excited to be joined by my neighbor just kind of down the road at the worse school in Virginia. Well, it's actually the better school, but we won't get into that right now. Stephen Hopkins. Stephen is an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Virginia. He teaches Old English and Old Norse languages and literatures, as well as courses on the history of the English language and medieval literature generally. And his recent book, which I'm very excited to be talking about, is called Translating Hell, Vernacular Theology and Apocrypha in the Medieval North Sea. So, Stephen, welcome. Let's go to hell.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's probably going to be harrowing, right?
We should probably warn people that there will be a lot of puns and kind of dad jokes. You more so than me. I mean, my students are subjected to kind of an endless supply of kind of dad jokes along the way. But this is a man who I have on my show right now who is notorious for his humor and his bad puns. So, and by bad puns, I mean excellent puns. But
that's how I wound up at the worst school, actually. So
that's right.
Although I think I am contractually obligated to shake my fist at Virginia Tech, but now that I've done that.
You should. It's another thing with students is like every time I mention kind of UVA in some kind of weird regard or something like that, the students are all like, boo, hiss. And I'm like, I really don't care. But like for the purposes of this class session, I want you on my side. So like, yeah, shake my fist.
Right, yeah. Rivalries, whatever.
Yeah. We're all in the same boat. So yeah, we care about the same governor's races and boards of trustees and stuff like that. So anyway, that's a whole separate podcast about higher education.
The real hell.
That's right. That's the real hell. Yeah. So government bureaucracy and higher education. Anyway, all right. Before we actually get into things, I mean, we're already kind of into things. I do feel obligated and to ask you our silly question that we like to start off our show with. And it is silly, I think, because it involves time machines. The silliness derives from the time machines thing, because I think, anybody who's studied kind of the past in any kind of significant way, I think we're all confronted with a time machine question at some point, like by somebody at a party or a family member or something like that. They expect us to want to kind of go back in time. But my question is a little bit different than that. So I hope you'll indulge me. The question is this, is that let's imagine for a moment we have a single-use time machine. And there and back, you don't have to stay anywhere, but it's there and back. And it has a caveat, and it can only be used for one purpose. And that is, it has been presented to you, Stephen, and you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a young Stephen Hopkins, they will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How do they respond to that news?
I think that they would be honestly not surprised.
Okay.
I think going into this whole mess, young Stephen was aware that he was constitutionally not built for much else. The hand-eye coordination wasn't there. The career prep, tests that they made you take, they all came back negative. So, it's kind of like buckle up because it's either fast food for life or nail this, right?
Okay. All right, so you were kind of primed for this. You were ready to experience the joys of the Middle Ages. Was it always kind of the medieval that kind of had that this time period that had kind of an attraction to you? Did you start somewhere else? Did you kind of get sucked into it, or was it there from the start?
So I just made that joke, and I don't know that it's entirely accurate. I think actually that kid would have been kind of surprised at medieval specifically. I grew up reading a lot of fiction by people like, J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
And I had no idea that I was medieval coded. I grew up playing video games like, Oblivion, Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which is set in a fantasy Middle Ages. I gravitated around all the Monty Python and the Holy Grail was my absolute favorite, right? Which is why I've got the Black Knight up there.
Yep.
And I had no clue. I was oblivious to the fact that I thought everyone was just this interested in the Middle Ages. So I think that particular thing would have caught me off guard. I went into undergrad wanting to study archaeology.
Hmm.
I knew I wanted to do something with the past, but the embarrassing part is I mostly had watched too much Indiana Jones, and I didn't really understand what that discipline entailed until I declared the major and found myself doing field work and absolutely loathing it.
No, I think there's something about Indiana Jones who is responsible for that series is responsible for probably more archaeologists actually pursuing their field and embittered former archaeologists who have left that field because the archaeology is actually nothing like what Indiana Jones actually does. I was exactly the same way. I wanted to do something kind of with the past. Like I didn't know what it was. I wanted to do archaeology because, I don't know, the hat was cool. The whip was great. He got to travel a lot. And then I spent exactly like, I don't know if exactly the same thing, but I spent time in a lab sorting arrow points.
Mhm.
And I was just like, no, never, not again. Not even once more. That's the end for me. So
Yeah, I did a dig where I was digging, through like a 19th century homestead in Ohio because, that's what archaeology looks like there.
mhm.
And I was like collecting brick fragments and little bits of like soda glass. And basically what I realized was the circle, like if you have a Venn diagram, the circles that are jigsaw puzzles and getting filthy in humid trenches, just make that one circle and that's archaeology.
Yeah.
Maybe that appeals to some people, but I hate jigsaw puzzles even in air conditioning. So
Yeah.
it was not a good fit.
No, I think there's something, we had Sarah Byris who works on the Cahokia Mountains in the national parks out there. And she's an archaeologist as well. And she spoke so passionately about like the excitement of archaeology. And like, I was getting excited about it too, but like, yeah, it's not for me. And I'm glad that there are people out there. It's kind of like reading German scholarship. Like I'm glad that somebody does that work, but like, it's not the thing that I want to do.
Different strokes for different folks, and I
That's
have
right.
all the respect in the world for my archaeology colleagues out there and
Hmm.
anthropology as a discipline. It took me some years to figure out that I needed to figure out how to take my passion for the past and bring it more indoors.
And bring it more indoors. That's right. More towards gaming and reading books and things of that nature. So
Yeah.
the fantasy element, going back to that, which you and I have kind of talked a little bit about in the past in a non-podcast venue, that seems to be a really common thing, though, right? For a lot of medievalists, is that the Tolkien Lewis kind of fantasy video games, increasingly movement into medieval studies. Was there something about kind of the aesthetics of that, or kind of the setting of that you recognized as medieval? Just trying to think back, like now, having done this for a long time, recognizing like understanding Tolkien and Lewis, were medievalists themselves. Like it makes sense, that connection, but I gotta say, like when I was growing up reading fantasy novels, which I started with like the Dragonlance series, that was kind of
Mm.
my first foray
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and my kind of first love, is like I didn't think of that as medieval necessarily.
Yeah, like I said, I didn't really think of myself as medieval coded either. I just thought
Mm.
like I like fantasy. I like the sort of epic struggle between good versus evil. And I liked, thinking about, I mean, I think part of it for me was the sort of religious background that I grew up in
Oh, okay.
and sort of, my dad was a pastor. And so I spent a lot of time in churches, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes just because there wasn't childcare. And so, he'd be working in his office all day, and that's what I did in the summer. But, when you're bored in a 19th century church and there's not much else to do, there's old books, there's like the
Hmm.
library, there's like all the like stained glass and stuff to like spend time with.
Yeah.
And so, like the symbolism, like all the tropes and
Hmm.
narrative things were extremely, extremely familiar to me, right? And so I mean, that was one thing that I liked about Lewis, and I think, that's something that Tolkien hated about Lewis, was the heavy-handed allusions,
Yeah.
right? But as I was reading them, I was like, oh, I recognize that. Oh, I know where that's coming from. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a cool reference to whatever obscure biblical text, right? So I think that was one road into it for me, was that they happened to be medievalists who were also, deeply engaged with that narrative tradition.
Mm.
And so, yeah, helping me sort of see it from a different angle. But it really wasn't until really wasn't until undergrad when I had a real library at my disposal, right? Not just my dad's old seminary library in the
Sure.
basement. But when I had a real library and I could actually start exploring, well, what did these guys write besides fiction? I started reading some of their actual academic work, and I could track down their sources or texts that they mentioned, the Pearl Poet or something, or this
Yeah.
Gallon Night thing. And I realized there was so much more richness that they had been drawing upon. And it turns out that I actually was attracted to the genre. I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
I just needed someone to sort of point me in that direction.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting too, is that you don't know what your interests are until you kind of have a structure of understanding kind of what those things actually mean. Like I love how you're describing the way that you were attracted to kind of the genre and kind of the stories, and it was connected to kind of your upbringing at the same time. But then it was something like in the process of education, a teacher, a class, or something like that, and like then it clicked. You had already kind of laid that foundation of interest, and then like, oh, that's why I'm where I am right here. This is why I find this stuff particularly interesting, because you can't like predict that. That's kind of one of the joys, I think, of teaching, is seeing that click with other students and realizing as you're following even today, like a research project, right? It puts you in a lot of unexpected directions that can be incredibly fruitful.
Yeah, and since this is the American medievalist, to give it even more of an American context, I think that process of discovery for me was really tightly linked to the fact that Western Ohio, especially in a mostly pre-internet world, is kind of a book desert.
Mm.
I grew up in a town that literally did not have a library, and our school
Wow.
library did
Okay.
not let you check out books. You were not allowed to bring books home,
Yeah.
and the stock was insanely limited. Right, it was like a couple thousand books, like 2,000 books or something. It was a very small. So my options were very limited. If my dad hadn't had the books that he had, who knows what I would have done.
Yeah.
But I couldn't explore bibliographies and things like that because, again, like the internet was in its infancy in the late 90s,
Sure.
and there were no bookstores really at all unless we went all the way to Columbus or Toledo or something.
Yeah. So, I think just another kind of truism is that we're all haunted by our parents' choices in one way or another, right? Is that, if your dad hadn't collected the books that he had, like it wouldn't have set you off in that direction. So, and I've talked many times on this podcast too, like just poring over the very few history books that my parents kind of had on their shelves, mostly about the American Civil War in my case. But, just reading and reading and reading and reading, sometimes the same books just over and over and over again, because like you said, like that was what was available. I was home. There weren't a lot of other things. That's what was there. So
Yeah. Yeah.
but let's transition a little bit to talk about some of your current research, because you just have a book that's just very recently come out on translating hell. So can you just kind of walk us through, just kind of very basically, what is the book about? Because this is taking kind of a big concept that I think even people who aren't familiar with kind of the Christian tradition, let alone kind of the medieval Christian tradition, they have a sense of kind of what hell might be. They certainly have images, I'm sure, in their head. It just kind of conjures things immediately. But I think you're kind of troubling that, not just kind of the images that we have, but the idea that this has been a timeless concept at all.
Yeah. The project had its genesis to some extent in the fact that, well, if you've ever driven through Ohio or Indiana, billboards about how hell is real in all capital letters with fire, right? They're everywhere. I've seen billboards that said turn or burn, right? This sort of imagery was sort of all over the place for me growing up. And again, I think I too was under the impression that heaven and hell are sort of these two cosmic destinations and destinies that have been a fixed part of the Christian tradition from like day one, whenever you think that was. And so that was sort of what I had assumed growing up. That's what I'd been taught. And as I got into grad school and was reading things like Beowulf, for instance, that's what really kicked this off. There's the scene at Grendel's Mere where there's the fire on the flood and Beowulf's about to dive in there, right? And all the scholarship was like, you should read the Gospel of Nicodemus because this is probably based on that and the description of the mirror and sort of this hellish space. At any rate, the book is about how hell is there's only like 6 verses in the canonical Bible, in the New Testament especially, that deal with hell specifically. The hell looms large in the imaginations of Christians, especially for people who believe that a lot of humanity is going to wind up there. But it's actually very vaguely defined if you go hunting for specific verses, sort of as proof texts. And so that's where the investigation started for me was, well, what does it actually say? Like, what is there? Actually, there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. There's worms that devour. There's probably fire. But beyond that, there aren't a whole lot of other references that are specific or detailed. So my question initially in grad school was, how did we get from those handful of verses to the sort of complex, rich, layered, symbolically very heavy version of hell that we get in, say, Dante's Divine Comedy, in the Inferno? What happened in the middle there? Right. And I think one answer to that is Apocrypha. We have this canonical body of texts that raises a lot of questions about hell and about who goes there and about why they go there and about what happens there and how long it lasts and all of these questions that people naturally have, right? It's their curiosity about this destiny and this destination. But there's no real canonical answer. And so they have to go somewhere to flesh that idea out, to translate it within their own local circumstances. I think Apocrypha are an especially productive site for experimenting with theological narratives like this
Mhm.
because they are, I would say, liminal. They, on the one hand, look and sound like canonical scriptures, but they're not canonical. So some people felt free to revere them because they seemed just like the other canonical epistles or gospels or whatever genre. But on the other hand, some people knew that they were not canonical and so felt free to revise them. And this sort of dynamic is what allowed people across the centuries, all the way from really early Christianity and late antiquity, all the way across the Middle Ages, to basically ask and answer questions about the afterlife using apocryphal texts, which often traveled alongside canonical texts and manuscripts, which really even blurred that line even further.
Yeah, I mean that was something I remember too, very distinctly too. One of my first courses, I was thrown directly into the deep end when I started my PhD. Was the only graduate course on medieval studies that was offered at Berkeley. The first semester I was there was on medieval exegesis. I didn't know what exegesis was. It was just, it said medieval on it. So I registered for it. And the grad director was like, yeah, that'll be fine. And then I think she probably laughed at me. So I learned not only like about the long tradition of biblical translation and kind of additions, but also commentary on it. And then there was this whole thing, you've mentioned Apocrypha several times. There's this whole set of other texts that aren't part of, as you say, kind of the canon, but are revered and used and very heavily disseminated throughout the European Middle Ages that people, read and thought about extensively. And so could you talk a little bit more about kind of what these texts are and kind of like where they came from and why they retain, like you talked a little bit about kind of why they were popular, but about like how did they still exist after kind of the formation of what we think of it kind of as the canon in the, fourth-ish century or something like that?
Yeah, it's a complicated question.
We like the big questions here. So
Right,
yeah.
right. Part of what makes it tricky is if we go all the way back to the deep roots of time, of course, our manuscript evidence gets more and more fragmentary. Eventually, we get to papyrus fragments, which are literally fragmentary, right?
Mhm.
And so it's hard to tell exactly what existed at the very, very beginning of these things. But I will say that Apocrypha, I mean, according to New Testament scholars, Apocrypha are composed roughly at the same time as a lot of the canonical texts, right? Especially if we're thinking about the New Testament. These are all emerging from a first to third century context in a lot of cases. So, someone like Bart Ehrman might say that they were rivals for a while, textual
Mhm.
rivals, and certain communities adopted some and not others. That is, it's hard to be definitive about the origins of them. But the fact is, you ask about sort of why are they allowed to endure?
Mhm.
To answer that question, first we need to talk about church governance. There's this document called the Galatian Decree, which it actually turns out to probably be a forgery, but it's an influential forgery. And supposedly, it's a papal decree that says this is a list of prohibited books. Christians are not allowed to read these because they're spiritually dangerous, is the gist of it.
Mhm.
And then it's a list. It's an actual list of texts. So these are known apocryphal texts, and some of them might be things like the Gospel of Nicodemus, or the Vision of St. Paul, or the Penitence of Yamnes and Mambres. And so the point of issuing that kind of list is to sort of tamp down on people who are reading these texts in addition to their Bible.
Mm.
They have their Bible, but they're also reading other things that are not necessarily part of the Bible, and that might have aberrant teachings or that would have, possibly dangerous implications
Yeah.
for church governance, depending on which text we're talking about. Or sometimes it's just the mere fact that they're not canonical and therefore not worth your time as a Christian. You should be reading things that are actually spiritually edifying, right? Different church authorities and fathers have different opinions on this. But at any rate, ironically, that list actually almost codifies and canonizes Apocrypha after it starts circulating because
Mm.
now a shopping list of texts that you shouldn't read. And some people read that list and thought, wow, I need to find that text and read that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing better than for curious people to encourage them to look up something than to ban it, right? It's just
Yeah,
like,
it
oh,
was even
why
people
shouldn't
banned
I read
Mythos.
that? I should go check that out immediately. Like I never even heard of that before, but thank you for pointing that out. I think too, the thing that's fascinating about Apocrypha too is that it reveals in a lot of ways something we've talked about in the show before, is how varied Christianity was and why early church scholars, for example, and medievalists too, oftentimes talk about Christianities,
Whoa.
like in the plural.
Yeah.
Like it's not just kind of one thing. And that butts up against, I think, a very popular conception of the Middle Ages in which there was a church, they told you a thing and you did a thing. But that is absolutely not the case, that religion is practiced at a very local level, that there's lots of different things kind of going on. Text, libraries, we were talking about local libraries. Local libraries could vary in the Middle Ages, like quite differently about kind of what they were, and including what they thought was particularly important. So one of those you mentioned was the Gospel of Nicodemus, and that has something to do specifically with hell, if I'm remembering correctly, right? Like, so could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so the book focuses on two hell texts in particular. The Gospel of
Hmm.
Nicodemus is one of them, the Vision of St. Paul is the other.
Okay.
And I think talking about the Gospel of Nicodemus also gives us a chance to think about why Apocrypha were written in the first place in a lot of cases. The Gospel of Nicodemus it's called a gospel because, well, in terms of genre and style, it reads just like the other canonical gospels. It tells the life story of Jesus. But it specifically focuses on the passion narrative, on the trial under Pilate, and the crucifixion. But when you read it, you quickly realize that the real purpose of this text is to elaborate upon what happens after the crucifixion, but before the resurrection.
Yeah, it's kind of this blank space, right?
Easter
Yeah,
Sunday hasn't happened. What's going on Saturday? Is he just
yeah.
napping in there or what? It turns out he's not. He's actually quite busy. Christ descends into hell and he liberates first he smashes the gates of hell. And then he liberates the prophets and patriarchs from the Hebrew scriptures and leads captivity on high, which is a reference to a line in a Pauline letter. And so it becomes this very triumphal narrative that shows, it actually shows how salvation works. It's a natural question, I think, for people to say, how would the death of this one guy in the Middle East, matter for other people? Like, how would that change things spiritually? This text gives you an answer. Well, it allowed him to descend into the grave and smash hell forever and liberate souls. So it's a very concrete answer to that sort of question. And I think Apocrypha in general grow out of these sorts of moments of curiosity where, you're reading, say, I don't know, the book of Genesis, and it tells you that Adam lives to be 930. It's incredibly natural to say, what did he do for all that time? What is it like to live that life,
That is a lot of years. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so then you naturally enough have Apocrypha like the life of Adam and Eve that pop up and tell you what that life was like and how miserable he was after he got kicked out of paradise. He never smiled or laughed his entire life until he heard a certain prophecy. This is also coming from the Gospel of Nicodemus because, everything after Eden was just terrible compared to paradise. So anyway, yeah, I think curiosity is a big part, because people who actually, believe this faith tradition see these texts not just as texts or stories, but they're invested in them in a way, and encouraged to read them again and again and to think about them. And the more that you spend time with the text, you should be curious about it. You should have additional questions about what's going on with the characters, or what about that detail, or any inconsistencies you notice with another canonical text. So Apocrypha often grow out of these sorts of moments of close reading, basically, where there is no canonical answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And it reveals too, I think, partially the fact that medieval people were people. And so they were curious about things, like they thought about things and they understood kind of these, not necessarily kind of gaps within kind of the scriptural tradition, but certainly kind of these spaces in which there was more story that could be told. And for a variety of reasons, they weren't included in, the Gospel of Luke or Matthew or kind of whatever, or any of the other kind of canonical texts. But there was a space there that needed to be discussed. And so these texts are kind of created to fill that. And hell seems to be kind of a big thing within that, right? Like it's pointed at, as you mentioned, kind of, with a very few references within the canonical text. And that's how that's kind of expanded, but your book also kind of pulls in, kind of non-canonical, or I should say non-apocryphal texts, like other types of texts as well, in which the kind of tradition develops kind of over time, right? And you're specifically thinking about kind of in the North, one of the big texts that, people think about men, they think about kind of Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages as Beowulf, for example. Like, are there references to hell there in Beowulf?
Hardly.
Hardly. Okay.
I would say there are 1.5 references to hell in
Okay.
Beowulf.
Okay.
The one that is explicit is around line 180 when Hrothgar, you were hearing about the Grendel problem for the first time, and the narrator says that in their sort of heathenish hope, the Danes turn to devil worship and they imperil their souls, right?
Mhm.
So they seek the consolation of hell, basically. So that's the explicit mention.
Okay.
Now, I will say the word shows up a couple times because Grendel is called a hell runa, now that I'm really thinking about it, which we don't totally know what that term even means. Someone who has hellish secrets, witchcraft, basically. And then the half that I was thinking of is the description of Grendel's mirror. The language there is evocative of the Old English translation of the Vision of St. Paul, where hell is described and there's fire on the flood, and it's similar to that sort of imagery. So hell, it's sort of at the margins of that poem a little bit, to the extent to which Beowulf is concerned with it's looking back upon and valorizing a pre-Christian culture, even though it's written within a Christian context. So hell sort of creeps in because of that concern, but it's far from central to that poem.
Yeah. No, and that leads me in. Maybe this is a silly question.
We've already done time machines.
Doesn't involve time machines this time. So this just involves the bizarre workings of my mind. So, but I'm curious, like, is there a sense at which hell, within the medieval Christian imaginary, like kind of moves from idea to specific place? Because I'm thinking about the difference between saying something like they turn to kind of the Hrothgar reference to hell, for example, is about the devil, right? Or about kind of demons or something like that. The description of the mirror is a specific thing in which there's aspects to a place that exist. Is that movement kind of something that starts to happen, or am I conflating two wildly different things here?
What we might be hovering around is what I call in the book localization.
Okay.
Where we're taking sort of an abstract theological idea and then sort of embodying it or translating it conceptually, right? Not just translating it word for word, but taking the idea and making it understandable for an audience based on their world and their worldview. I think, maybe that's what's going on with Grendel's mirror, is that the poet wants to evoke something that his audience would have been terrified of, the thought of hell, and wants to sort of paint Grendel with the scariest colors that the poet knows.
Yeah.
The infernal colors. Old English poetry in general is full of eschatological moments. You're reading about the Old English whale poem in the Exeter book. For the first half, it seems to be about a whale that eats fish. And then, it's an allegory for Satan, because the back half is like, well, the whale is actually Hellmouth and it's swallowing souls.
By the way.
Yeah. Old English literature is full of poems that take what we call homiletic turns, where the narrator has been talking about this thing, and then they turn to you, audience member, and remind you, kind of like the freeway signs that I saw growing up as a kid, that it's, turn or burn.
Yeah.
You've been hearing all of this. Now it's time to get your crap together, because one day you will face hellfire.
Yeah.
And I think actually that sort of homiletic turn, as we call it in Old English scholarship, is one of the main reasons why hell has to be retranslated, reconfigured, given, new flesh over the bones again and again and again in the Middle Ages, is because that's one of the main things that people used it for. They wanted to reform people's behavior or get them to see the world in a new way and act differently in the world. And the way you did that was by pointing to hell. But of course, again, there's not a lot of concrete canonical references to hell. So every time you bring it up, you kind of need to do some work on it yourself. You need to translate it, localize it.
Yeah. Simple and Clean is a show where hosts Misha Stanton and Mayana Baron and friends talk about Kingdom Hearts, a little video game franchise about really big feelings. Join them as they discuss a thing that by all rights probably shouldn't exist, but it does because it's cool. Each week, they attempt to unravel how this deceptively expansive game series has touched an entire generation of deeply earnest weirdos, and along the way, realize that what they're talking about might not just be a video game, but a whole lot more. New episodes every Sunday, wherever you listen to podcasts. How much of that localization, I mean, and I think, thank you for actually making sense of my chaotic question there as I was trying to kind of work through this. I mean, this it makes much more sense now. And I'm sure our poor listeners are deeply grateful for this. But I'm wondering too, like how much of this is an individual's choice? Like if there are these moments in which you are trying to tell an audience specifically, like a sermon or a homily or a poem or something like that, how do these tropes kind of emerge? Like we have kind of bigger texts like the Gospel of Nicodemus, for example, like in other apocrypha or canonical texts that circulate much more widely, and so they can kind of pull from those types of things. But some of the stuff is much more localized, right? Like not just kind of hell being localized, but like one manuscript copy of Beowulf, or very few manuscript copies of something else. But then you start to see themes. Do we have any sense of kind of how those ideas kind of travel, or how much individually kind of was just kind of left up to the individual preacher if they're using it in this homiletic way?
Yeah, that is a really sticky question, because what I didn't want to do in the book is I did not want to trace a history of hell or a history of like the images, like in sort of like an evolutionary way, right? To show
Sure.
that, oh, in the second century it looked like this and it grew this way slowly. Some of that does emerge because some traditions do actually go viral, if you will. Some ideas, like, the Vision of St. Paul is probably the most viral of these. The idea that there's a stratified hell where people are punished according to their sins, in proportional ways. If you lie, you're hung from a tree by your tongue, stuff like that. So that idea goes viral. But a lot of the localizations that I look at, I say in the book that I'm trying to look at dead ends in a sense, because I'm not so interested in, how did some individual small change all texts later, but more like, why did one scribe or one redactor or translator decide to change the image in this way for this audience?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I'm focusing more on maybe scribal creativity or moments of improvisation where, what message, like what was the payoff of that particular experiment? Maybe it didn't go on and get used again. Sometimes they do, like Niðurstigningar saga in the Old Norse chapter, the first manuscript, the oldest manuscript we have, which is, this is the Old Norse Gospel of Nicodemus. The oldest manuscript we have is from about the year 1200, which is quite early in Old Norse prose. It's amongst our oldest prose texts in the language. It actually went on to have, I believe, 4 more major copies made, which doesn't sound like a huge textual tradition, but again, you got to remember the Icelandic corpus is modest compared to other regions. So to have like 4 or 5 copies over, I think it's like 4 centuries, is pretty significant. It shows sustained interest in that text, sustained recopying.
Yeah.
And so that particular experiment must have been mind-blowing to enough people that it was reproduced in those ways. Whereas some things that I look at in the book, like the Old English penitence of Yamnes and Mambres, seems to be a one-off to some extent.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, those are incredible. Like, I mean, the idea of survival of these one-offs is always kind of really interesting to kind of think about, but also too that there was this specific author, so sometimes authors or scribes or however you want to describe them, like making a specific decision in a moment about trying to convey something. So, and hell seemed to be like a malleable enough concept for them to do that with?
Yeah. And again, I think it goes back to the fact that it is so vaguely defined, but also so necessary to bring up. And you see moments where, well, I guess there are texts where hell is the background. It's like where the text is set. And so you need more elaboration. And sometimes hell is the point, right? It's the warning. So there are different like layers and different like valences for how hell, like to the kinds of rhetorical use that hell could be put to. But the thing is, it's useful in so many ways that it winds up being ubiquitous. I think it's easy to look at medieval art, medieval literature, and say, wow, these people were like morbidly obsessed with hell. But I think another way to think about that is hell was insanely useful rhetorically. It was a Swiss Army knife that could be put to just about any use that you could imagine. I even have examples in the book of hell as a place where joy is sparked because of its linkage with Easter and the harrowing of hell.
Okay. That's not what I would think of hell as, but okay, sure. I mean, yeah, you do you, medieval scribe. I'm curious too, sorry, my brain's been working a little bit here as you've been talking, and I'm thinking about something you mentioned kind of when we were talking about Beowulf medievalists are kind of talk a little bit about, is about the trickiness. Maybe this is not a fair word, but the trickiness of the poem itself as it exists between kind of a Christian and a kind of a pre-Christian existence. And I was thinking too, I was re-looking at the life of Saint Martin of Tours earlier, which is a fourth century biography, holy biography, hagiography of Martin of Tours, in which it talks about the devil taking forms. It doesn't talk about hell, but it does talk about the devil taking different forms of the Greek gods specifically. And I'm wondering, like, is that kind of part of that Germanic carryover? Did they play a role as kind of either kind of Valhalla or the Norse ideas? Like, did they play a role in kind of localization of hell, or do the gods themselves kind of emerge, the Norse gods emerge as kind of demons within some of these stories that you're looking at?
Yeah, so you're kicking a hornet's nest in Old Norse scholarship.
Excellent.
So good work.
We've already annoyed anthropologists and archaeologists this episode,
true.
so let's just keep going.
We should alienate everyone else.
100%. Yeah.
So part of, just like with Beowulf, a big fraught question is, okay, so we have these texts that were clearly written. The fact that they were written down means that they were written down by Christians, because at this point in history, Christianity and literacy are intertwined cultural forces. So we have this whole corpus of texts that are written by Christians that are about pre-Christian, heathen religions. Why? Especially given that there are so many Christian voices from well before the Middle Ages. You go back to late antiquity, early Christianity. You've got someone like Augustine or Jerome being very grouchy about whether we should pay attention to pre-Christian stories. Are they edifying or not?
I mean, Jerome was always grouchy, but yeah, that's a separate thing. So anyway,
although Jerome's actually slightly more relaxed about this, I think he says that you should read Apocrypha if you're mature enough to handle it, to sift the muck for gold, he says.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's actually slightly more complicated than it is fun to make fun of Jerome. but yeah, the idea that the old gods should be gotten rid of is kind of a commonplace. This is why I actually start my Old Irish chapter out talking about Saint Boniface. He's an Irish missionary sent to the continent, and he's with the Saxons. And to prove that their gods are basically fake and impotent, he hacks down this sacred tree that's dedicated to Donar, is what it says in Latin, which is cognate with Thor. And the fact that he's able to desecrate this holy space and nothing bad happens to him, he doesn't get struck by lightning, that shows that the Christian God is powerful and that Thor is just in your head. Related to this, we don't know anything about Old English pre-Christian beliefs, like the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. We only know the names of their gods because the names of the weak kind of preserve it. We don't have any legends or myths about them, which is radically different from the situation in Iceland and Norway, where we have a huge corpus of texts. So all of these are relevant to that question of, why did Christians write these things down? What are they doing? And also, did the pre-Christian material shape hell? I think that's actually what your original question was. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the doctrine of hell is pretty robustly developed by about the 700s. And so we don't see instances. What we see are, when we see localizations of hell, we see local motifs creep in. So the folk belief, for instance, that is still prevalent in England, I believe, that murderers or criminals should be buried in the north quadrant of a churchyard. That goes back to a medieval belief that hell was in the north. And, that's also where Peter Dinzelbacher has a really cool essay on this. But that's also where, in Old Norse, in the poem Völuspá, it says that in the extreme far north, there's this place called Corpse Shore, Naustrand, and it's woven out of serpent spines, dragon spines, and souls are tortured in there, right? They circle this river of poison. And it's where all the oath breakers and all the murderers and all the men who took other men's wives, that's where they're punished. And you look at a moment like that and you say, is that syncretism? Was that a genuinely part of pre-Christian belief?
Yeah.
In the North? Or is that something that they heard a missionary preaching and they adapted into their mythology? Or is it a Christian author even later who has decided to make up an Old Norse hell? Yeah. And it's really hard. I mean, people argue bitterly for all of those positions in scholarship. It is really hard to tell. What I focused on, though, in the book, I do talk about Völuspá and all that stuff if you're interested. But what I really found productive and interesting are moments where hell is merged with some of these traditions in ways that has a big payoff culturally. So when I'm thinking about the
Hmm.
Iceland, for instance, there's the Old Norse Gospel of Nicodemus, Niðurstigningar saga, which just means the saga of the descent, right? Christ's descent into hell. In that text, the text follows the Latin fairly faithfully at the beginning. But then there's this moment where in the Latin text, Satan hears about the crucifixion, and he's having a debate with hell and with like this personified death, and they're all debating whether this whole crucifixion thing was a bad idea.
Okay.
Hades isn't in the Latin text. Satan is an idiot, and Hades is actually quite smart. And Hades is like, "You're making a big mistake. Bringing this is the guy who brought Lazarus, who made me vomit up Lazarus. So if we bring him down here, it's going to be bad for us. Why did you do that?" And Satan goes, "Oh, well, I saw him crying in the Garden of Gethsemane like a little baby, so I know he's not really God. I know he's really a man." In the Old Norse version,
Whoops.
I know, right? And that's part of the dramatic
Yeah.
irony, of that text. In the Old Norse version of it, while they're having this argument, all of a sudden the narrator sort of interrupts them and says that Satan heard that the crucifixion was happening in Jerusalem, and so Satan shapeshifts into the Midgard serpent and flies to Jerusalem to
Ah.
devour Christ off the cross. Which, that in and of itself is a pretty striking syncretism, to have him turn into a mythological dragon.
Yeah.
But then it says that when he bites the cross falls down on him and catches him like a fish on a fish hook, or a mouse in a mouse trap, or an Arctic fox in a snare, which is like the most Icelandic metaphor ever. That's like an animal that only lives in
Yeah.
Iceland. But the idea that the Midgard serpent could be caught on a fish hook, that's coming straight from an Old Norse poem, from an Old Norse Eddic myth,
Hmm.
Thor's fishing trip, Humskvida, where Thor goes out sailing with a giant, Humir, and they're going to go on a fishing trip. They sail way to the edge of the world where the Midgard serpent lives, and Thor has conveniently ripped off one of the ox heads of this giant to use as bait. So he whips the ox head into the water, and of course the Midgard serpent comes and eats it, and Thor almost catches him. He's like straining, trying to pull this Midgard serpent up, because they're cosmic enemies. They're supposed to kill
Yeah.
each other at Ragnarok. Spoilers. But Humir is a chicken and doesn't want to see the Midgard serpent, so he cuts the line, and the Midgard serpent escapes, to fight another day at Ragnarok. So I argue that the Old Norse, the Icelandic redactor, is layering that myth over the crucifixion, in order to explain
Hmm.
how the crucifixion, how Christians, like how salvation works in Christianity. In this case, what he's saying to his audience is, how Thor almost caught the Midgard serpent and almost killed him? Well, Christ actually did that. He's like better
Yeah.
than Thor, right? He's the true and better Thor in that sense. He catches the Midgard serpent and kills him. And that's how you are saved from hell and from sin, because, it's basically using what we would call typology in exegesis, biblical typology, and using the Old Norse myths as a sort of local Old Testament, which is
Yeah.
unbelievable.
No, that's incredibly fascinating. The way that that's specifically adapted, in which it presupposes, right, an audience who knows that poem, right? Because it's a cute story kind of without, or not a cute story. I mean, it is kind of cute, but it's an interesting story kind of without it. But it takes on these incredible layers, and it's specific that it's the Midgard servant that the devil can turn into, which again references to the devil as the dragon, like as a serpent again from the book of Revelation, and so
And Genesis.
and Genesis, right? Like an astute understanding of how these things are kind of all connected, and an interweaving of these different kind of textual, or at least intellectual traditions too. But also too, I'm struck too. I was mentioning, like I was reading Martin of Tours is about kind of this old. I don't know if it's just Roman. It's not just a Roman idea, but like the kind of contest of the gods, right? Is that when Martin is able to perform miracles, and the devil is kind of confounded, even though he's appearing as Jupiter or as Mercury or something like that in many times. And then there's other kind of examples from late antiquity as well. Is that seems to be happening too, right? Like in which Thor, he almost did this. Jesus did that. Like that's a better thing, and therefore our God is more powerful.
Yeah, and so so the idea, I think Augustine is the one who probably says it most clearly, where he says that all the heathen gods are just demons in disguise. Is his language. And so like that's a stance that is quite popular, especially in early medieval England. Someone like Alfred loves that idea, and in fact adapts it into a homily, and Wulfstan recycles it after him. So he actually has a homily called De Falsis Dies, right, on on the false gods. And he walks through exactly that. He says that the heathens believe in someone called Woden. Woden is Mercurius. They're all demons. Turn or burn.
Yeah.
But it's really fascinating to see that that's not the only position that's available in 10th century England. Alfred specifically calls out the Vision of St. Paul and says that it is a foolish book and no one should read it. And he actually says, the reason for that is actually in the Bible. We haven't really talked about the Vision of St. Paul, but in First Corinthians, Paul is talking about himself in the third person. People have questioned his credentials. Like, why are you allowed to be an apostle? Because you weren't even around when Jesus was around. You've never even seen the guy, right? And so to defend himself, he switches into the third person and he says, well, look, if I were going to boast about apostolic authority, I would say that I know a guy who saw a vision and was taken up to the third heaven and was revealed, like all these mysteries were revealed to him, and he's not allowed to talk about it. It explicitly says he has been forbidden from talking about it. And so, like, it's this weird moment in that Pauline epistle anyway. Ironically enough, somebody decided that we need to hear what Paul saw when he was taken up to the third heaven. That seems kind of important. Why did you bring it up, man?
Yeah.
And so they give him, or they attribute this whole vision where he's taken on a tour, first of heaven and then of hell, and he's shown all these things that explain like why Christians should behave in a certain way, and it becomes sort of a didactic text in some ways where you're taught if you do X and Y, you're going to be tortured in corresponding ways. So don't do it. So Alfred says, don't read that book. And here's why we know it's false and why it's foolish to read it is because Paul himself says that it couldn't exist. Paul says he was forbidden from sharing that. So how could there possibly be a real book about it?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Alfred has to issue that warning, presumably because it's popular. Because people are reading it and because people find it useful and are recycling its tropes. And we know that's true because, like, even in the Blickling homilies, which would have been contemporary with Alfred, there's a whole homily based on the Gospel of Nicodemus and the harrowing of hell. So it is being preached in some places, and some people in the church don't like that.
Yeah, and how live these debates were, right, about what was an authoritative text, right? Like that you could have, someone like Elfrich and then the Blickling homilies, like exactly like whoever the author was of that, like just using different sources, and that's just kind of what it was. And that's kind of how it worked. Going back to kind of the Norse gods or the influence of, not necessarily the influence kind of Norse mythology or anything like that, but again, kind of the use of figures or images, right, that would have been familiar. Like, did you kind of encounter that a lot in the sources that you were using for your source, like, references to the Midgard servant or to Thor or something like that? Did that seem to be a well that in the vernacular sources you were looking at, kind of in the North Sea region, that people were kind of pulling from, or were they more kind of traditionally Christian mostly? Or what we would say, I should say, that are traditionally Christian?
Yeah, that's a cool question. And I'm thinking about things that I did not write about in the book, but that were in the dissertation and that I discarded. So I think part of what you're asking about really is myths about hell and Satan that are not really in the Bible, but that lots of Christians believe. Like the whole myth of Satan's rebellion and that we read about like in Milton or places like that. The idea that he was Lucifer and that he was the brightest, shiniest angel, and that he was so prideful that he rebelled against God and took a third of the angels with him. None of that is in scripture.
Yeah.
None of that is in the canonical text at all. It's based on a weird reference in Isaiah 14 where the day star falls, right? And medieval exegesis basically took that prophecy about a king from like the 600s BC, right, when Isaiah's being written, and said, no, actually, like, yeah, sure, it had that historical origin or whatever, but what we're more interested in is the fact that was actually typologically a prophecy about Satan's rebellion and his fall, and about sort of the eschatological implication that eventually Jesus will come back and crush him, right? And so there are these moments where these weird exegetical symbols start stacking on top of each other. So Satan is one of these people who entities. He is a serpent because of the book of Genesis, because, he becomes a serpent to tempt Adam and Eve. And of course, in pre-modernity, The line between serpent and dragon is quite blurry. And so he's a serpent in Genesis. And then in Revelation, the great dragon is cast down and slain by the archangel Michael. So that must also be Satan. So now we can equate serpent and dragon. But then there's also the weird beast that's mentioned in Job chapter 40 or 41, the Leviathan.
Yep.
That God says, Job, can you draw him out of the water with a hook? And he breathes fire and he's like all coated in scales. Sounds like a dragon. So medieval people said, therefore, Satan is the Leviathan, Satan is a dragon, Satan is a serpent. And anytime you see any of those, you can actually typologically read it as Satan.
Yeah.
So you'll actually see homilies in Old English that will gloss, like as they're translating from Latin into Old English, they will actually gloss words like serpens in Latin with Leviathan or with dragon. Or in Old Norse, they start glossing it with Midgard serpent or Jormungandr, which is the other name for the Midgard serpent. So it actually becomes like a gloss, like in their minds. Not that they had dictionaries, but they are actually one-to-one substituting Satan, dragon, Midgard serpent regularly, it seems like.
Oh, wow.
And that's the sort of thing that can only grow out of these layers of apocryphal interpretation on apocryphal interpretation.
So they're using the terms kind of interchangeably, right? Like, and so you're seeing, if I'm understanding, okay, wow, that's really interesting.
And those sorts of things only work when you are deeply steeped in these texts.
Yes. And that's, I think that's something too, is that one of the things we haven't talked about is audience, right? Because I think oftentimes that's a question that, I get a lot, I'm sure you get a lot as well, like often, from students and things like that, or just kind of general people, like who are reading these texts. So it suggests like you would have to understand, kind of like have a deep sense of multiple traditions sometimes in order to kind of really understand. So are we really talking about kind of a learned kind of clerical elites here that's these texts are circulating in, or can we suggest something wider? Because the thing problematizing my question, right, is that some of these are homilies, right? They're delivered oftentimes orally to audiences.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Is that some texts, sure, are probably for an elite. Especially some of the old Irish texts I look at are kind of obscure and maybe as just for the monks to enjoy amongst themselves. But then there are homilies that I look at in that chapter and every chapter really, which, as you say, homilies are. This is where the worst pun of the episode is about to happen. Homilies are weapons of mass instruction, right?
Boom.
So they are meant to be popular discourse. They are meant to be like what is taught to everyone, and everyone is supposed to go to church. Of course, the existence of Letter and Force suggests that maybe they didn't always go as often as they were supposed to. Nevertheless,
fair enough. Yeah,
I do think that like the corpus of texts that I study suggests that maybe lay literacy with these tropes. I used literacy in scare quotes there for listeners. They're not, a lot of them aren't actually able to read per se, but they know these things from hearing them, right? It's sort of we're in between. We're in a transitional moment between like oral culture and literate culture. Nevertheless, they would be I think they would be a lot more familiar with some of these Bible stories than we might assume. Especially apocryphal traditions. Brian Murdoch has a book on what he calls the medieval popular Bible. And by that, he means like there's the scriptural text, the canonical texts that people would have probably known pretty well. They get preached on all the time. Your church is just covered, literally plastered in images of these narratives. So you'll know them from that. But then there's the extra layer of apocryphal stuff or saints' lives, hagiographic lore that travels alongside these stories and are also going to be plastered all over the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time you enter that space, you're looking at a scene from the book of Revelation. You might also be looking at something from the harrowing of hell, which is the Gospel of Nicodemus. And so, when things are conflated in that way, or when they're presented orally in a homily, you could see why non-canonical texts might be viewed as equally authoritative with canonical, because they've been talked about by the same priest publicly to you. And unless the priest goes out of his way to say, no, this is non-canonical, so it's not as important, then why bother preaching that, right?
Yeah.
They don't usually do that as far as we know.
Yeah, and then importantly, too, as you were pointing out, like they occupy the same visual space, too, oftentimes that you could see something from a saint's life, something from an apocrypha, something from, a canonical gospel right next to each other on a church wall. And you see that every day, and you're not, you see that, you're gonna take a meaning from that, and you're supposed to take a meaning from that, is that these are on a kind of a parallel plane in some ways.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's one reason why I was so attracted to writing about Apocrypha in general, is because I think it gives us a window into popular belief.
Mm,
These texts are among the most popular texts from the Middle Ages period. We have almost 500 copies of the Gospel of Nicodemus still extant today. That's an astounding number, compared to the
yeah,
one copy we have of Beowulf, or the
yeah,
one copy we have of most texts, many texts.
yeah,
We have over 500 still extant, which, means that that's probably the tip of the iceberg of what was actually produced. The Vision of St. Paul is almost as popular as that. So, odds are, if you wanted to read either of those texts or have them read to you, you probably had a 50% chance with every medieval library that you walked into of encountering one or the other. They were
yeah.
they were ubiquitous. And I think that's because there was an audience that was so hungry for them.
Yeah, that they were useful in some real way, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
not just in a kind of a instrumental sense of kind of being used in homilies, though they were so, but just they meant something to the people who were copying them, and they were an important part of people's libraries. So
Precisely, yeah.
we are unfortunately kind of running towards the end of time here. This has been a really interesting conversation. I think that we could probably keep talking about health for many more minutes.
For an eternity.
For an eternity, even. There you go. So yeah, but bump. I'm going to ask our editor to put in some rim shots for the sound effects later on. But anyway, Stephen, this has been a delightful conversation. If people do have something called the internet and they want to find you, find out more about you or your work or your book, where would you direct them to?
I am most active these days on Blue Sky. So if you want to look up Phil hyphen lol hyphen ogist, it's like painful to say out loud.
Yeah.
Philologist, which is also painful to say out loud. That's my Blue Sky handle, .bsky.social. I think that's why
Yeah.
that's why Blue Sky's not popular, right? It's so dorky. I have a Twitter account, but I don't like that place anymore, so you won't find me there as often. I do have a WordPress if you want to, or my official UVA web page if you want to see what I've been up to publications wise. So I think those are the main outlets.
Okay, so lots of places to find you. Just Google
You just look
Stephen
up
Hopkins.
philologist. Yeah, philologist.
Philologist with the LOL as the lologist, which is
Yeah.
again another great kind of pun, which, yeah, unless you understand something about kind of the history of medieval scholarship, you might not get, but you will very soon as you look it up. Thank you again, Stephen, for joining us. Thank you again to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. Until then, take care, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.